So before we get started, does anybody have any questions about any upcoming assignments?
What are we, at some point in class, are we going to go over that thing that's going to be in the second paper?
You mean the annotated bibliography?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to bring a sample with me on Monday so that you can see what one looks like. And I'll also bring you some more specific guidelines than what's on the assignment sheet to give you all a sense of how to do that. And we will go over, I think in the week we come back, or maybe the week before Thanksgiving, I think it's the week before Thanksgiving break, we will also discuss how to use the library databases to get your sources. So
Is Thanksgiving break not this week but the next week?
it's the week after next, I think, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think we have another 2 weeks after that, yeah, before
yeah.
finals, yeah.
But now we pick finals like before we go for like on Christmas break.
Yeah. So finals is then an extra week after the last week of classes.
It's like, are we going to have like a paper kind of like as our final?
Yeah, the paper is the final for
Paper
this
two.
class. Paper 2 is your final assignment, yeah. Because I mean, as I've said, like like in the composition class, I don't learn shit about what you can do from an exam. An exam is basically pointless. All right, so here's what we're gonna do. I want you two to sit facing each other here for a moment.
Do you want to just sit there and turn around?
That's absolutely fine. This is an exercise that I was frankly hoping we would have more people here for, but we'll work with what we got. All right, so the basic idea here is that you are a judicial body that's been formed by a new government operating under a new constitution. There are two major ethnic groups in the country, each of which is represented on the board. Normally I would do this proportionally, given their share of the population, but there's only 2 of you, so we're just going to ignore that. So here are the known facts about the country and the circumstances that the research you've done so far has uncovered, right? So first off, Group 1 is the old ruling group, right? So before the new Constitution, Group 1 was in charge. They're a lot smaller than Group 2, and they're a settler population. They're not native to the country. Their ancestors came to the country about 150 years ago. They also have most of the economic power in the country, right? So they control most of the money, most of the land, most of the natural resources. So here's a list of Group 2's grievances against them, right? So when Group 1 was in charge, they did not allow Group 2 any political representation in the legislature. They cut off Group 2's access to elite educational institutions. They forced members of Group 2 to live in segregated neighborhoods and to obtain special passes if they wanted to travel outside of them. They allowed employers to discriminate against Group 2 in hiring practices. And they passed laws limiting free expression of political opinions by members of Group 2. In fact, at least one incident, probably more. Police from Group 1 fired on unarmed protesters from Group 2, killing several and wounding others. Now, Group 2 is substantially larger, it's the majority of the population, and it's composed of natives of the country. They control the new government, right? Simply by force of numbers. And here is the list of grievances Group 1 has against them, right? So members of Group 2 attacked a group of police officers guarding a political prisoner, killing several and wounding many others. A band of saboteurs from Group 2 took over an electrical plant and threatened to destroy it if their demands for the release of political prisoners and a new constitution were not met, though this actually ended with police storming the facility, killing the ringleaders, and arresting other members of the group. A protest against travel restrictions became violent, and members of Group 2 forced their way into a Group 1 neighborhood, looting shops, setting fire to buildings, and injuring several civilians. Members of Group 2 were also apprehended in an attempt to assassinate the Group 1 Prime Minister. And finally, a rogue organization within Group 2 firebombed the Group 1 elementary school, killing several children and teachers. So what you have to do here is figure out what you're going to do about members of both groups that committed crimes against the other under the old regime, right? In Group 1, most of these people are former government officials, particularly people who were involved with policing and security. In Group 2, they're mostly leaders of popular resistance groups. So many of them have a good deal of public support, right? While as many of the people in Group 1 have a good deal of institutional knowledge and know how to work the system. So you have to figure out what you're going to do with them in order to try to make everybody happy and in order to try to reconcile the two populations to each other, right? You have the following options. You can deal with leaders of extremist factions in both groups harshly, execution, life imprisonment, exile, and something like that, right? You can hold members of one group more culpable for the conflict and punish them accordingly, right? You can decide that, well, Group 1 was more culpable, so they'll get punished worse. Or Group 2 was more culpable, so they'll get punished worse. You could just decide to call it a day and find everyone involved innocent of all charges. Or you could negotiate a settlement on some other terms which you will determine yourselves. Now, a couple of things you're going to want to remember as you try to make your decision, right? One, a lot of Group 1 stuff is going to be hard to document because it's fairly easy for government officials or former government officials to kind of just band together and lie, right? They can just say, well, no, there's a lack of reliable witnesses to things they did in Group 2. The other problem is that if you don't keep Group 1 happy, right, if you don't come up with a settlement they're satisfied with, then most of them are going to leave the country and take most of the money with them, right? And because they still own most of the land, too, that also complicates things. If you don't keep Group 2 happy, right, then you have the chance of a popular revolt on your hands. And they have, they make up the majority of the population, they have the numbers, so that can also cause real problems. So what you need to try to do now is try to think up the best solution for dealing with the crimes that these groups have committed against each other, in terms of reconciling them to one another and getting them to live together in this new country, right? Because you want this new government to survive. All right, so let me know if you have any questions and just try to talk through it. Remember that there's option 4, which is basically none of the above, figure something else out, right?
So we would just create, if we pick number 4, we would just create like our own settlement for both of them?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
They should like evenly, not evenly, like contribute some of it to group two, because if group two is not good enough, they'll wash out and like basically go fight, and that could cause like more problems. You know what I mean?
Who would that make group one have been? What if they're like, I'm not giving my money, and it's me.
And the other thing to think about too is like what argument might group one use to make, like, are they gonna say specifically, I'm not gonna give my money away, or are they gonna say, like, what about our school, or what about our electrical plan? Right, are they gonna, make their case in terms of keeping their stuff, or are they gonna make it in terms of grievances they have against the other group? Right, in negotiation, remember, you often have to give something in order to get something, right?
So,
They're the most economic power in the country.
so we're not, one of the group two has to like, basically rebuild on the damages they caused in order for group one to like.
If they don't want to do
See, it's hard. Because like I was
it. Like, they
saying,
could be looking at like, why, right?
but I was saying like, if groups, say like group two had to like rebuild, but they like messed up. And then in order for group one to like give money in that way. Like they're saying like, we won't give you the money.
Like, unless you fix
like
it.
help rebuild what you messed up. Like he said, give some, give some,
Yes. That's one way they can.
I cannot find anybody else gave.
I know.
I mean, I don't think it.
And then so basically like, if group two agrees to fix what they damaged, group one could
Group one will pay
give,
us,
yeah,
and we'll give them money for
okay.
what they did.
I don't know. Cause like, just cause they're fixing what they damaged, why would they give money for that they damaged it?
Because remember,
Like they're fixing what they did. Why would another group give them money for?
because basically like, they have damages. for,
So
like-
group two's fixing group one's damages?
And then group one is like,
We're paying.
for like the damages done. Because remember, group one has money.
Yeah.
So they're basically saying like, group two is like fixing what they've done, and then group one is basically like,
So
For
if group
what
two
they
fixes
did.
what group one damaged, and group one can give some money to repay them.
for what they've done.
I think you're saying what group two agrees to repair
Yeah.
what, like, things that they damaged, like the electrical plants, or,
Okay.
pay damages and, to the school and things like that. And group one would allow them, their resources to be redistributed, right?
Yeah.
It's, whether, in the form of higher taxes or whatever. Y'all can take as long as you need to think about this, right? Like, but yeah, when you've got an offer that you think you're ready to make, then
I mean, nobody in the sense is going to be completely happy with the decision.
Same as this. One of those things.
Because it's keeping, like problems we might have.
okay. So here's the upshot of the offer you made, right? You managed to keep both of them at the negotiating table, but group one says, right, you can fix a building, but you can't bring back the people who were killed in that firebombing, right? We want to see justice done. We want to see some people punished. And group two says, you know, it's nice that you want to redistribute the wealth now, but how are you going to pay us back for all those years of lost opportunity and for all of those, you know, times when we were locked up by police without bail, people didn't know where we were, all those people you just kind of disappeared over the years, right? How are you going to be held accountable for that? So the economics of the situation is easier to fix, right? But dealing with people's feelings is a lot harder, right? And one thing that we have to remember, I think of it like we tend to think of human beings, or some of us anyway tend to think of human beings as logical, rational animals, right? But most of our decisions are actually made on, you know, a gut level and basis of emotion, right? And on the basis of things like our social ties. So how would you satisfy these demands for justice from both groups?
I mean, there's nothing you can really, like, I get that they're upset about the lives that were lost in the fire, but, like, what can you really do besides, like, have, like, a memorial or something?
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing to really, you can't bring back, like, those feelings, and those feelings are always going to be there, so group two can't really do anything about it. So, like...
Yeah, you're right. You can put a building back together, but you can't reconstruct the human, like, unless you're Victor Frankenstein. You can't reconstruct
yeah, so, like,
the
I just don't
human
know, I don't think they would ever be happy.
Yeah. Well,
Feelings, like, you know what I mean? Like, they could try to solve the problem a little bit, but their feelings are always going to be there.
yeah. Well, what they're specifically demanding is that someone be held accountable in some way for what happened.
Well, they're both accountable in some way.
Yeah, I mean, you know, you're dealing with a situation where, like, you know, both sides in this conflict have done terrible things to each other over a long period of time, right? And there's a deep level of grievance that needs to be overcome. Well, you know, it's funny that you should actually say therapy, because when we actually get to talking about the Desmond Tutu essay, right, that actually is, it's not specifically part of the solution, but a lot of the language that he uses is like the language of medicine and healing and therapy and disease.
Therapy if I have a problem.
I can't think of, like, because like you said, I feel like at some part during this whole thing, like, both of them did, like, both of them were at fault.
Like, I mean, I guess maybe not fully equally.
Yeah.
Like, probably one maybe did worse than the other,
Yeah.
but still they both did bad things.
Because obviously, like,
And you can't just punish one.
And if you punish anyone,
It's gonna cause a problem.
then that causes problems as well, right? So I mean, like, you see how hard this is, even when you're just given an imaginary situation, right?
Judges.
I feel like everyone's...
You know what I mean? In like custody battles.
Sure.
You're on the back crowd, the mom's done, and the back crowd, the dad's done, and they're like, well, who do I send this child to live with?
Yeah. Or, you know, like at some point in your lives, you're probably going to be called up for jury duty.
Yeah.
And you're going to be asked to, you know, make these kinds of decisions about a defendant's innocence or guilt, and then you know what's to be done about that
I
defendant.
think it's crazy that, like, members of the jury can, like, persuade, like, if you're guilty or not. I think that's so crazy that a few people can justify if you're guilty or not.
But don't they go through like interviews?
Yeah.
Like ask you about.
Yeah, the prosecuting attorney and the defense attorney both have to agree on the jury pool. They interview everybody to make sure that,
You're not like one-sided.
yeah, they'd like to try to prevent bias and to keep crazy people out and things like that. It's not a total fail-safe, because one, people lie, and two, defense attorneys and prosecutors both have means of getting their way on a jury in ways that actually, for example, I know there's a complaint right now about the jury in the Ahmaud Arbery case, that there's 3 white defendants who are accused of killing a black man, and there's only 1 black juror, the other black members of the jury pool were excluded supposedly on criteria that were not race-based, or that the defense could indicate was not race-based, but you still end up then with a jury that kind of matches what they want. So yeah, jury pools can be manipulated by people who know the system well. And that actually illustrates part of the problem with holding Group 1 accountable, right? Is that because they made the old system, they knew all its ins and outs.
Better than you too.
Exactly, yeah, they knew how to manipulate it for their own benefit.
This is hard, like.
Yeah.
I can find it in law school.
to be fair, most of the things you would be asked to do in law school, like the fate of a country doesn't hang in the balance, right?
And then even with a person's life, is in your hands pretty much.
Yeah.
And I don't want that.
But if you're called up for jury duty, you don't have a choice, right?
How do you know you have to be registered to vote?
Different states do it differently. In some states, they just look at the driver's license rolls. In some states, they look at who's registered to vote. I think I don't know how they do it in Georgia. I know that weirdly, I've only been called up for jury duty once in my life, and it was in Pennsylvania, and I didn't live there anymore, so I was able to get out of it.
My mom's been called 4 times.
My wife gets called a lot. Yeah, when we lived in D.C., because they use the driver's license rules there, and they're allowed to call you up more often because the pool of jurors is relatively small.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, she ended up serving on 4 juries in the 8 years we lived in D.C.
Wow.
My neighbor got called and she called me and she was like, oh, because we were supposed to do something.
Uh-huh.
She's like, I'm about to go in. She's like, watch this. I'll be out in 10 minutes.
Uh-huh.
And 10 minutes later, she called me. She's like, I left. I was like, how do you get out of there? She's like, I told them my back hurt and they felt bad for me.
Uh-huh.
I was like,
Yeah. I mean, there are various stratagems that people use to get. My uncle used to always just say, "Oh, well, Satan told me to be here today," and they just say, "Okay, he's schizophrenic or something. Let's let's exclude him."
she's like, she's old. But
Yeah.
She pulled back hard.
Yeah. And I think it also probably depends on how desperate they are to get jurors on a particular case. But anyway, so let me share with you what the solution the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission came up with was, right? So they did end up offering full amnesty to anybody accused of crimes against another racial group. However, there was a caveat to this, right? You only got the amnesty if you made a full public confession. As long as you were willing to cop to what you did in a public forum and have it go in the public record, you would not be prosecuted.
So you basically confess in front of everyone?
Yeah.
Oh.
You confess, but everyone knows what you did, right?
Yeah.
And I think, like, if we look at, so you seem a little doubtful about this solution.
I just think, like, I feel like even confessing to the public, you still, like you said, it came with amnesty. Like, yeah, people are gonna look at you different and know what you did, but like,
Yeah.
I feel like that's not that, like, I would do it.
Wouldn't that make
Like, I
things
fully
worse,
can-
though?
What's that?
Wouldn't that make things worse on them? Because like everybody knows what you did, and you're gonna be treated differently for what you did.
And you know, here's the thing though, like in places where this happened or where this model was followed, it largely didn't lead to that. In fact, people who had got the amnesty still went on to serve in government roles. I'll give you the example of, say, like Northern Ireland, where there was a long-running conflict between Protestants who wanted to remain part of the UK and Catholic nationalists who wanted to join the Republic of Ireland. And particularly in the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of violence in that part of Ireland. There were car bombings, buildings bombed, several people killed on either side. And they followed this same model in the late 90s when they were given the opportunity by the British Parliament to form their own regional government, which needed to include members of both groups, right? So they issued the same kind of amnesty, and what ended up happening was that the first minister and deputy first minister, because of course you couldn't call either of them second minister, they both have to be first ministers, so you don't step on anybody's toes, were leaders of extremist factions. You had on the Protestant side the Reverend Ian Paisley, who was the leader of a particularly reactionary and violent Protestant faction. And on the Catholic side, you had Martin McGuinness, who was the leader of a nationalist, a Catholic nationalist, kind of vaguely leftish militia, right? Now, both of these guys, if they hadn't killed people themselves, they definitely signed people's death warrants, right? They definitely signed death orders for other people to go out and kill. They managed through this process to, at least for that time, put aside past differences. And I think the reason for this is, again, this necessity of full public confession. And let's look at Tutu's essay for a moment to see why this was necessary and effective, right? I want to look near the beginning of the essay here, page 368. Can I get one of you to read the paragraph for us that starts with South Africa remembered that several people had died mysteriously. It's the last paragraph on page 368.
368?
368, yep.
Last paragraph, the South Africa remembered?
Yep, that's the one.
South Africa remembered that several people had died mysteriously while they were in police detention. It was alleged by the authorities, who might perhaps have been believed by most of the white community. They were certainly not believed by most of the black community, that they had committed suicide by hanging themselves with their belts, or they had slipped on soap while showering, or they tended to have a penchant for jumping out the windows of buildings while they were being detained and questioned. Others died, so we were told, from the self-inflicted injuries. One such was Steve Biko, the young student founder of the Black Consciousness Movement. It was said that he banged his head against the wall in an inexplicable and quite unreasonable altercation with his interrogators on September 1977. People recall that when the Minister of Police was told of Steve's death, he had callously and memorably declared that his death leaves me cold. People recall that Steve has been driven naked on the back of a police truck over 1,500 kilometers to Pretoria, where it was reported he would have received medical treatment, except that he died soon after arrived there. No one ever explained why he could not have have not gotten to emergency treatment in Port Elizabeth where he had been detained, nor why, if he had to be taken to Pretoria, he had to be humiliated, comatose, as he was, by being transported without any clothes on.
Okay, thank you. So
Why does
let's...
it say had? Is that a typo?
No, it's just, it's passive voice.
Oh, had.
But let's focus here on the details of the story that Tutu tells here, right? Particularly about the detention of the civil rights leader Steve Biko. So what's the official narrative here, according to the government, of what happened to Steve Biko?
Isn't the government saying that he banged his head against the wall?
Yeah, he just started banging his head against the wall, right? We don't know what happened. He just went nuts, started banging his head against the wall. And what else is and then after he bangs his head against the wall, what happens?
Well, they said that the Minister of Police was told like about the death, and it said it leaves him cold.
Yeah.
Like that's like kind of suspicious.
Yeah, the Minister of Police basically doesn't care that this guy died in police
Yeah.
custody, right? And then what else is weird about the story they tell about what happened to Biko?
It says that people said that they saw him naked on the back of a police truck.
Yeah.
Like, why was he naked?
Yeah. And what's the official explanation for why he was naked on the back of that truck? How is the government explaining it?
Because he was like, where's he would ever see medical treatment? He didn't get like the medical treatment.
Yeah, he's like, he banged his head.
Yeah.
We got to take him 1,500 kilometers away to Pretoria to get him We can't get him emergency medical treatment here. We got to take him all the way over there. So he has to be.
What is comatose like?
So do you know what it means to be in a coma?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we the state of being in a coma. Yeah, comatose. Yeah. So he banged his head against the wall. He has to travel far away for emergency treatment, because apparently in Port Elizabeth, where he was being held, they can't treat a head injury, right?
Yeah.
And sadly, he just happened to die on the way there, right?
I'm just still confused why he has no clothes on.
Well, and I think, Tutu actually says exactly why he has that the government has no explanation for that, right?
Yeah.
That basically it's to humiliate him.
Yeah.
That it's just one more indignity, right? So
Yeah, I guess.
so we can kind of construct from the story a narrative of what actually happened, right? During interrogation, the police banged his head against the wall and had to concoct a story quickly.
Saying that he just did it.
Yeah, saying that he just went nuts, and what were we supposed to do? And they, instead of getting him medical care locally, they took him far away because they knew he was likely to die on the way, right?
Yeah, and I feel like they wanted to make it like a public scene to humiliate him.
Yeah,
That's why they
exactly.
chose that.
Exactly. So he's naked on the back of a police truck, unconscious,
Yeah.
and dying. So, what does this story indicate about relationships in South Africa between the white community and the black community? What's missing in that relationship? What does the black community not? Why does the black community not believe stories that come out of the white community? And think about this in terms of what full public confession would do. What might that build?
I feel like, I don't know if this is right, but I feel like the white community is higher up on like the social aspects, so they're gonna believe whatever the white community says over the black
Sure.
community. So
They're gonna stick with their own, right? They're gonna stick
Yeah.
with the status quo.
But
Because they trust each other, right?
Mhm.
So the thing that's absent in the relationship between the white community, especially the government, right, and the black community is trust.
Mhm.
What Tutu is pointing out here, right, is that the police and the security services have lied to us so many times that we have no reason to trust them.
Yeah.
And this would solve that problem, right? We have, all of these political prisoners who just vanished. Nobody knows what happened to them, except whoever disappeared them. So if we ever want a full accounting of what happened, if we ever want to build trust between these two communities that don't trust each other, then everybody has to make a full public accounting of what they did. And I think that it's important to note here a couple of other models that Tutu tries on here and rejects, right? So he talks about the Nuremberg Trials. Do y'all know what the Nuremberg Trials were?
I've heard of it, but I don't know.
Okay, so the Nuremberg Trials were in the immediate aftermath of World War II. And these were trials of accused Nazi war criminals. That were run by the Allied forces who had been victorious in the war, right? So these accused war criminals are being tried, right, not by other Germans or other Austrians, but by British, Russian, and American military personnel mostly, and government officials.
Yeah,
And-
oh,
So
sorry.
go ahead, no, yeah, go
I was just
ahead.
gonna say, on page 370, it
Uh-huh.
talks about there would have been no negotiated settlement resulted from the negotiated settlement, and then I skipped down a few lines and it says while the Allies could pack up and go home after Nuremberg, we in South Africa had to live with one another.
Yeah, that's the big difference,
Yeah.
right? Is here you've got the trial being run by outsiders who don't actually have to live in the country afterwards with the people they've put on
Yeah,
trial,
they can just
right?
leave.
Yeah, they don't have to remain in this situation. And by the way, I'm not at all trying to suggest that Nazi war criminals should not have been tried and convicted, right?
Yeah,
Please.
God.
And neither is Desmond Tutu. But he is trying to point out why this is not a good analogy for the South African situation, right? Because the Allied forces could just go home when it was over and didn't really have to deal with the fallout.
Yeah.
Whereas, yeah, people in Germany still had to walk down the street together and look at each other. Now, the other model that he looks at, if you look on page 373, can I get somebody to read the paragraph that starts with, then there were those others who opposed the trial option and suggested rather glibly. It's the first long paragraph on the page.
Then there were those others who opposed the trial option and suggested rather glibly that we let the bygones be bygones. This was much sought after by the members of the previous government and those who had carried out their
Behest, yep.
and their security forces. They clamored for a blanket or general amnesty as had happened in, for instance, Chile, where General Augusto
Pinochet.
and his cohorts gave themselves amnesty as a precondition to handing over from their military
Junta.
to a civilian government. Even though they agreed to the appointment of a truth commission, such a commission would deliberate only behind closed doors, and the record of General
Pinochet.
Pinochet and his government and the security forces would not be scrutinized by the commission, certainly not for the purpose of apportioning. It has been important in the whole debate over impunity, and to point out that General Pinochet and his officers in government forgave themselves. They alone knew what precisely they had done. They were accused, the prosecution and the judges in their own case.
Okay, thanks. You can stop there, actually, right? So, what happened in Chile when the military dictatorship handed over power to a civilian government? What happened to people in the old military dictatorship? What consequences did they suffer?
It says that him and his government and security forces will not be scrutinized.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and then it says like certainly not for the purpose of what's apportioning?
Apportioning blame?
Is that just like
Yeah, assigning
blame?
blame, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so to give you all a little bit of context on Augusto Pinochet and the sorts of things that Pinochet was found to be guilty of. I had a neighbor when I lived in when I lived in New York on the east side of Manhattan, across the hall. He was Chilean. His parents were actually asylum seekers.
They were what?
They were asylum seekers, or they'd been granted asylum in the U.S. Because they had been politically persecuted in Chile in the 70s. They were prominent members of the Chilean Communist Party, and Pinochet was making people who were members of that party disappear, right? They were just vanishing, and nobody knew what had happened to them, although a lot of people suspected. Their families didn't know, their friends didn't know. Nobody knew what was happening to these people until, in the 1980s, their bodies started washing up on the beach. So Pinochet was vanishing his political opponents and murdering them, and then essentially tossing the bodies out to sea. And in this accounting here, like, what price did Pinochet have to pay for having done that? Did he even have to admit to people that he'd done it?
No.
Yeah. Any truth and reconciliation discussion happens behind closed doors, right? In private, nobody has to hear it. Pinochet and his cronies get off scot-free. It is, right? So, in Chile, we've got a situation where no one was held accountable, right? And if we look at the end of the paragraph, the part that I didn't ask Shelby to read, right? In the absence of amnesty designed, as it was in South Africa, to establish accountability, I am a strong supporter of the recent extradition proceedings against General Pinochet, right? He was brought back to Chile to stand trial eventually. It would be quite intolerable that the perpetrator should decide not only whether he should get amnesty, but that no one else should have the right to question the grounds on which he had so granted himself amnesty and for what offense.
So they're saying that he can't decide which. Wait, never mind.
So yeah, so Pinochet's condition for turning over power essentially was that he get away with everything, right? And the problem then, like, he was being extradited to stand trial again because this leaves the situation unresolved, right? And it becomes the government's problem again later on down the road because the people aren't satisfied with this solution, right? Not only that, but it also leaves no opportunity for building up inter-community trust. like the amnesty with confession solution would, right? And I'm also not trying to suggest that the amnesty with full public confession is necessarily a perfect solution, but it seems one that is pretty well applicable in the kind of situation that Tutu describes, right? You've got two communities that have been at odds for a very long period of time that still need to be able to figure out some way to live with each other. But the other thing that I want to kind of trace here for a minute, there is a pattern of language that I mentioned while you guys were still deliberating over what to do here, that I think is important for unpacking how Tutu understands all of this, right? So if we look on page 368, right, he talks about the debilitating legacy of apartheid. Right, he also mentions on page 373, amnesia. Right, on page 372, he talks about the therapeutic effect that talking to the commission had on people who had both been perpetrators and victims of crimes. Right, he talks about he compares not getting these stories out and sharing them to Alzheimer's disease. And I think there are two big ideas we can kind of pull out of this pattern, right? So what's the first and obvious link between all of these things? What do they all refer to? Debilitating, what's that? So debilitating, something that's debilitating is something that is like crippling, like persistently harmful, right?
So like what do those three have in common?
Yeah, what do these things all have? What's the pattern here?
It's like health.
Yeah, it's
Like
all
health issues.
yeah, it's all to do with health and medicine, right? Good. So what I'm trying to show you here is how to identify these kinds of patterns of language that run through a whole text, right? So this is an example of one. Now, there's another pattern that we see here as well. We talk about, what kind of health are we focused on here when we talk about therapy? Yeah, mental health, right? Right, mental or psychological health. Good. And let's think specifically also about what amnesia and Alzheimer's disease are. What do they attack?
It attacks it's the brain.
Mm-hmm.
It attacks gosh, I knew I used to know what part of the brain it was.
I know, but you're on the spot and it makes you
But
nervous. Yeah.
It's like where you don't remember things. Or
And
or
yes.
you forget things faster.
Yeah, these are both memory disorders, right?
There's a part of the brain that it happens. I don't remember.
Yeah. And that you don't need to that we don't need to figure out what's going on here, but it's good that you know it. But yeah, is it the frontal lobe where that happens? Where they think that happens, or?
Because there's like the 4 lobes.
Yeah. I know the frontal lobe is where like your understanding of consequences is kind of centered.
Yeah, I think it is, maybe.
Yeah.
I also maybe I found out like the orbital lobe, like where you see, it's like in the back of your head. So
Yeah.
whenever you hit your head, then you go like.
Yeah, so your vision dims. Yeah, it's because
I was
you.
like, what? And
Yeah.
then you have that big artery, so if you have a stroke and it messes with that artery, and because it can cause brain damage.
Yeah, yeah. Our bodies are actually weirdly inefficient, right? But yeah, and I think the fact that these are memory disorders, I think, is really important here, given the kind of thing that Tutu is suggesting, right? Right, he's suggesting everything go into the public record and everybody just come clean. How is if people just keep it to themselves, how is that like, say, like national amnesia or Alzheimer's disease?
So so nobody would really know about it, so it's kind of like they forgot about it.
Yeah, it's a bit like forgetting details of a shared past, right? Like kind of agreeing to forget details of a shared past, right? And what is memory kind of like? What do we tend to connect memory to? Like, why is the loss of memory so terrifying?
Because then, like, you feel like you feel lost.
Yeah.
And I feel like if I lost memory, I would be lost.
Uh-huh.
I feel like I wouldn't know.
Yeah. What specifically would you not know anymore? Like, think about, like, for example, what Alzheimer's disease does to you.
Sometimes you don't remember, like, who a person is, or sometimes you could only remember so far up. So you can remember this person, but say they only remember you until like age of 4, and now you're grown up, and they're like, "Who are you?" And you have to tell them, and they're like, "No, you're little." Like,
Yeah.
So it's like confusing.
Yeah, so it basically it can destroy or damage your family relationships, right? See, Alzheimer's is a loss of memory that's specifically kind of like you may not lose your sense of self entirely, but you probably lose your sense of how you fit into things or how you fit into your family and your community. And what about amnesia? What does it mean to have amnesia?
That's where you don't know anything.
Yeah, that's when your memory is just kind of wiped clean, right?
And you start over.
Yeah. So, if you have amnesia, do you even know who you are? Yeah, so amnesia, we're talking about a kind of total loss of identity, right? So the kind of therapy that Tutu is suggesting here is a kind of therapy to prevent, right, identity loss and community disintegration, right? And he's couching these in a kind of mental health care metaphor. Yeah.
So it's like basically it's like the amnesty is like basically preventing all of that from happening. Like people forgetting about it, or people
Yeah.
not remembering what happened.
Yeah, because of this provision in it, right? Because it has to be accompanied with full public confession. This way we can't forget, but we can forgive and move on. And this also then, brings to light things that otherwise people wouldn't know about. He mentions, for example, on page 371, like we were talking a little bit a moment ago, right, about people tending to stick with their own and preferring the status quo and preferring things not to change, right? So we get a good example of this kind of starting on the bottom of 371, right? right? Most distressingly, we discovered in the course of the TRC investigations and work that the supporters of apartheid were ready to lie at the drop of a hat. This applied to cabinet ministers, commissioners of police, and of course those in the lower echelons as well. They lied as if it were going out of fashion, brazenly and with very considerable apparent conviction. In the courts, it was the word of one bewildered victim against that of several perpetrators, other officers in the police or armed forces who perjured themselves, as they have now admitted in their applications for amnesty. It would have had to be a very brave judge or magistrate who would find in favor of the solitary witness, who would in addition have the further disadvantage of being black, facing a phalanx of white officers who really could never do such a dastardly thing as to lie in court. So what's the other effects that offering the amnesty for full public confession is having? How is it specifically helpful, for example, to that solitary black witness or victim?
I guess they kind of ever give them closure in a way.
Yeah, it's affirming their narrative, right? It's, yeah.
Like basically kind of like telling everybody like, I'm not crazy, like I know what happened. And
Yeah.
getting them closure that one person, like you know what you did.
Uh-huh.
And
Yeah.
gives you that sense of closure.
And it's like you know they're lying, but because they're all doing it together, they're all ganged up against you lying, right? It's your word against theirs. Since the police and security forces have control over the evidence, right? They can always just lie about inconvenient evidence or make it go away. Just as they, kind of made an inconvenient person like Steve Biko go away. So a big part of what this does, right, is affirm for people who had been victimized into the old system that they weren't imagining their oppression and that they weren't, the system really was stacked against them. You look like you're pondering something.
I was like, I take it all in, like I re-go, I go through it again.
Yeah.
I like remember it.
Uh-huh.
I got it.
Okay. So I think that that's another basic idea here, right, is that a lot of what we regard as truth is relative to our position, right, and is based on narrative, right, on storytelling. That the story that we tell about a particular set of facts is often going to be, it's often going to feel more real to us than the facts themselves, right? The way we're able to personalize a set of facts or organize them into a story, right? So if you look a little further down on page 372, right?
I was literally locked out of the building.
Oh, it's been doing that.
It was. I tried calling you multiple times. I know you can't answer the phone, but yeah, I was locked out. I wasn't I just wanted to let you know.
Yeah, the door has been sticking.
No, I've been trying to push my way into it. I was trying to hit the automatic button and yeah, I was stuck.
Yeah.
I had to wait. I'm sorry.
Yeah, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
That's never happened before. And I'm like, okay.
No. This building in general needs a lot of serious work and a lot of serious upgrades, and they're giving us new desks, great, but fix the damn ceiling.
Yeah.
Fix the bloody roof.
Yeah.
Fix the door.
I just want to let you know that I was locked out.
Okay. Yeah, it seemed like you were gone for kind of a while.
Yeah, and I was just sitting there. I was like, no one is here. No one's coming. And then
Right, because you're at it. You're when it's in the middle of classes and people aren't entering or leaving the building. Yeah.
Yeah. So I saw a group of a class that got out and they let me in.
Yeah.
I was like, yeah, I'm locked out.
All right. Well.
Anyways.
Yeah. So just kind of one more thing before we adjourn. Just kind of along these lines about kind of truth as narrative, right? That the story you tell about a set of events or a set of facts feels more real to you than the facts themselves, right? So when it came to hearing evidence from victims, because we were not a criminal court, we established facts based on the basis of a balance of probability. Since we were exhorted by our enabling legislation to rehabilitate the human and civil dignity of victims, we allowed those who came to testify mainly to tell their stories in their own words. We did do all we could to corroborate those stories, and we soon discovered that, as Judge Albie Sachs, a member of our constitutional court, has pointed out, there were in fact different orders of truth which did not necessarily mutually exclude each other. There was what could be termed forensic factual truth, verifiable and documentable, and there was social truth, the truth of experience that is established through interaction, discussion, and debate. The personal truth, Judge Mohammed's truth of wounded memories, was a healing truth, and a court of law would have left many of those who came to testify, who were frequently uneducated and unsophisticated, bewildered, and even more traumatized than before, whereas many bore witness to the fact that coming to talk to the commission had a marked therapeutic effect on them. So this idea of narrative truth is also connected to this idea of restoring the nation's mental health, right? And keeping memory active and alive. All right. So that's really all I had for you guys, and thank you both for actually being here and being engaged and paying attention. Do y'all have any questions? Okay, so I brought the wrong thumb drive today, so I don't have the reading questions for Letter for Birmingham Jail, but I'll send those out via email this evening. So just remember that reflection paper 6 is due tonight. Shoot me an email or come to the office if you have any questions. And we'll see you Monday. Have a good weekend.
Huge.